trying to go back to this story I mentioned a couple of days ago when I was making one of these videos about the legendary Buddha, who was supposed to, just after he'd been sitting under that tree for years and had achieved some kind of enlightenment, he was walking down the road and he was met by someone who, even from a distance, seemed to notice that the Buddha had changed in some way. There was something remarkable about it. And they went through a series of questions to do with, are you a god? This chap apparently said to the Buddha. And Buddha, of course, said no. So the chap said, are you a man? And he said no. So he said, well, what are you then? And the Buddha was supposed to have said, I'm awake. There's two things actually about that, I think, which are quite interesting. Maybe I'll separate those and make different videos. But the first thing is to do with, what is it about, how did this chap know that the Buddha walking towards him was transformed in some way? I mean, I'm assuming as a kind of natural, if this event happened, and there's absolutely no authority that it did, but let's assume that it did for a moment. If it did, then I would be looking for a kind of naturalistic account of that experience. I would not be looking for any kind of magical power that the Buddha had, that he wasn't glowing like a kid from the 1970s Ready Brek advert, or that he wasn't, I don't know, there wasn't some kind of weird magical, invisible magical force which communicated the specialness of this person. Maybe there was, but that's not where I'm interested in really. So if those things aren't the case, then what was it about this chap approaching the Buddha which had drawn this person's attention, which this person found remarkable, to the point of remarking upon it? As I say, I don't think it's anything to do with magic. And I think there's an argument I've read in, what's it called? Oh, there's a great book called The Transmission of Effect by Teresa Brennan. But in that she talks about communication through olfactory means, that you can kind of walk into a room and there might be something about the smell of the room that gives you an impression of what that room's like in terms of what's happened in it. But that's, I don't think that's applicable in this narrative about the Buddha and his perceivable specialness. I don't think this guy just smelt the Buddha coming and was stunned by his aroma. So if it wasn't those things, it wasn't magic and there wasn't his smell, I'm guessing it must have been something that was visual. I think there must have been something that he was actually doing, some physical way of being or physical way of moving that conveyed the impression of specialness about him. So I'm trying to work. So that, I think that's, that's pretty interesting to me. So this idea of specialness, or presence, if you like, or charisma, attractiveness, in and of itself must be something, I think, something purely physical. That's what it looks like. The second part of that, I'll see if I can continue with this. I'm not sure if I can get there with this thought. So the second part of that is, what is that specialness? What is he doing that's so different? Presumably, he wasn't doing something that would conventionally attract our attention. He wasn't being threatening, for example. Apart from anything else, you might find that your attention drawn to something threatening, but you probably wouldn't wonder what it was. You'd probably recognise it instantly. You probably wasn't looking particularly sexy that day. Again, you might, that would certainly attract your attention, but you'd recognise it for what it was, and you wouldn't start asking whether this guy was a god or not, just because he looked a bit sexy. So it's probably not a conventional or an easily attributable attractiveness that the Buddha was having, in which I'm choosing to characterise as presence or charisma. So it must have been something else. And there's something else that I'm kicking around at the moment. It's kind of captured in this phrase that the Buddha uses to describe his condition. He says he's not a god, he's not a man. He says he's awake. So there's something about the condition of awakeness which produces, as the Buddha is using the term, and I think it's a very specific way, which not only signifies his way of being, his kind of mental state, but also signifies the effect of that mental state on what his body is actually doing on a moment-to-moment basis. The awakeness of the Buddha is obliging him to walk in a certain way, to hold his arms and his head in a certain way, to speak in a certain way. It's probably underpinning most of his physical actions and most of his physical way of being. And that, in many, probably very subtle ways, I suspect. But the sum total of that organised physicality is the conveying of an impression which an onlooker finds transformed and interesting and possessive of something called presence. So whatever this awakeness is, that'd be quite a nice thing to have, I guess.